Don't touch me!
Samuel Hayes thought he'd seen the absolute worst of what human beings were capable of during the war. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him when he found a young woman tied to his fence that frigid Wyoming morning. The raw rope burns etched into her wrists screamed a story of torment and abuse that he desperately didn't want to believe. She was just a girl, barely 16, unconscious and abandoned like a piece of discarded livestock right on his property line. Her dress was torn, her lips were cracked from dehydration, and she'd been exposed to the elements long enough for the morning frost to form delicate crystals in her dark hair. Samuel knelt carefully beside her, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he fumbled to cut through the rough rope. 20 long years of living a solitary life on this sprawling ranch. And now, this. The girl stirred fitfully as the bonds fell away, her eyes snapping open, wide with the raw, untamed fear of a cornered animal. She scrambled frantically backward, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't touch me." But Samuel had already seen the ugly bruises blooming on her arms, the way she favored her left side, as if guarding a hidden injury. Someone had inflicted terrible pain on this child before cruelly abandoning her. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he recognized the telltale signs, the familiar wounds he'd tried so hard to bury and forget from his own deeply troubled childhood. "Easy now," he said, carefully keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." She studied his face intently, her gaze searching for any hint of deception, any telltale sign of a lie. Samuel Hayes was a large, imposing man, his frame made even bigger and stronger by 2 decades of relentless ranch work. But something in the genuine kindness reflected in his gray eyes must have finally convinced her, because she didn't run. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Emma." The word escaped her lips like a whispered confession, a secret reluctantly revealed. Samuel glanced down at the rope, still clutched in his calloused hands, then at the distinct wheel tracks leading away from his fence. Someone had callously driven her here in the dead of night and left her to die a slow, agonizing death. In the unforgiving Wyoming territory, that meant a gruesome demise by wolves, exposure to the bitter cold, or something even far worse. "Who did this to you?" Emma's face went completely blank, devoid of all emotion. It wasn't the innocent confusion of someone who couldn't remember, but the carefully constructed emptiness of someone who remembered far too much. "My father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The softly spoken words struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. He'd painstakingly spent 2 decades desperately running from the haunting memories of his own father, and now that specter was staring directly back at him through this young girl's haunted, terrified eyes. Samuel stood slowly, his mind reeling, trying to process the situation. He could simply take her to town and hand her over to the sheriff. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe, responsible thing. But Sheriff Morrison was notoriously a company man, a man who asked very few uncomfortable questions when it came to sensitive family matters, and Emma would more than likely end up right back with whoever had done this to her. Or even worse. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice still gentle. Emma nodded almost imperceptibly, struggling to her feet. Samuel watched her rise, carefully noting the way she held herself, as if constantly bracing for another blow, another strike. He made his decision without hesitation. "Come on then, let's get you inside." But as they slowly walked toward his weathered cabin, Samuel caught sight of faint dust clouds rising on the distant horizon. Someone was coming, and they were coming fast, and something deep in his gut told him they weren't bringing good news. The dust clouds were still miles away, but Samuel had long ago learned to read the subtle signs of the prairie like other men carefully read the pages of books. 3 riders were moving with the distinct urgency of men on a mission, a dark purpose driving them forward. He had maybe 20 minutes, perhaps less, before they reached his property. Inside the warm cabin, Emma sat rigidly at his kitchen table, her frightened eyes darting nervously toward the front door every few seconds. Samuel poured cool water from his earthenware pitcher into a dented tin cup and quietly set it down before her. "Drink slowly," he instructed gently. She obeyed without question, but her hands trembled so violently that the metal cup rattled noisily against her teeth. Samuel had seen that kind of deep-seated fear before, reflected back at him in the mirror every single morning for the first 10 long years after he'd finally mustered the courage to run away from home. "Those riders coming," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice even. "They have anything to do with you?" Emma's cup froze abruptly halfway to her parched lips. The raw, unfiltered look that instantly crossed her face told Samuel absolutely everything he needed to know. "He's coming back for me," she whispered, her voice laced with terror. Samuel moved silently to the window, carefully studying the approaching dust cloud. "Your father?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I was payment for his debts." Emma's voice was barely audible, a mere breath of sound. But then he changed his mind. Said I wasn't worth enough, that I'd bring shame to whoever took me. The softly spoken words hit Samuel like jagged stones, tearing at the scars he'd tried so hard to heal. He remembered his own father's voice, slurred with cheap whiskey, explaining in brutal terms how children were just burdens, and that smart men learned how to shed those burdens as quickly as possible. "So he tied you to my fence to die?" Emma nodded almost imperceptibly. Said the wolves would clean up his mistake. Samuel felt something cold and heavy settle deep in his chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but the familiar, unwelcome weight of a momentous decision, a decision that would inevitably change absolutely everything. He'd spent the last 20 years painstakingly avoiding exactly this kind of trouble, carefully keeping his head down, minding his own business, and staying out of other people's affairs. But looking at Emma, seeing his own deeply wounded childhood so clearly written in her terrified eyes, he knew with absolute certainty that he was finally done running. "Well," he said, his voice deceptively calm as he checked his trusty rifle hanging above the fireplace. "Looks like your father miscalculated." Emma stood up so abruptly that her rickety chair toppled backward, clattering loudly against the floor. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. "He's not alone. He owes money to dangerous men, and they're coming with him." Samuel turned away from the window, his gaze hardening. "How dangerous? The kind that burn farms and don't ask questions." The ominous dust cloud was noticeably closer now. Samuel could begin to make out the individual riders. There were 3 men, riding hard, and one of them was callously leading a rope that dragged something behind his horse. Samuel's blood instantly went cold. It was a message, a brutal warning meant specifically for him. They'd cruelly killed his cattle, dragged the carcass behind them as a blatant sign of what awaited anyone who dared to interfere. "They want you to know what happens to people who interfere," Emma said softly, accurately reading his grim expression. Samuel walked purposefully to his gun cabinet and pulled out his Winchester rifle, his movements precise and deliberate. 20 long years of peaceful solitude on this ranch. And now it was all ending, because he simply couldn't walk away from a child in desperate need of help. But as he methodically loaded the rifle, Samuel realized something that genuinely surprised him. For the first time in 2 long decades, he felt like himself again, like the man he was always meant to be. "Emma," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "You know how to shoot." She shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Then you're about to learn." The 3 riders stopped just outside of rifle range, close enough for Samuel to clearly see their faces, but far enough away to avoid his bullets. They were smart men, experienced in this particular kind of brutal work. The man in the center was thick-set, with graying hair and clothes that had obviously seen far too many saloons and far too many brawls. That had to be Emma's father, the one responsible for this entire mess. The other two were noticeably younger, harder, with the cold, dead eyes of men who killed without remorse, men who killed simply for money. "Hayes!" the older man shouted, his voice rough and gravelly. "I know you got my daughter in there!" Samuel stepped boldly onto his porch, Winchester rifle firmly in hand. Emma was now positioned securely at the back window with his old Colt revolver, her hands noticeably steadier now that she had something to do besides just succumb to fear. "She's not your daughter anymore," Samuel called back, his voice ringing with conviction. "You forfeited that right when you tied her to a fence." The man's laugh was ugly and mocking. "That little belongs to me until I say different. Hand her over, and we'll call it even." Samuel felt his finger tighten almost imperceptibly on the trigger, but he consciously forced himself to stay calm. These weren't just random drifters. These men had the unsettling confidence of men backed by real power. "Who are you working for?" Samuel asked, carefully probing for information. One of the younger men answered without hesitation. "Marcus Devlin sends his regards." Samuel's blood turned to ice. Every rancher within 100 miles knew that notorious name. Devlin effectively owned half the territory through sheer fear and the other half through cold, hard bullets. If Emma's father owed Devlin money, then this wasn't just about a runaway girl anymore, this was about something far more dangerous. "Devlin wants his property back," the man continued, his tone menacing. "The girl was collateral on a debt. Her daddy here decided to dispose of the merchandise instead of paying up." Emma's father shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, avoiding eye contact. "She ain't worth what he was asking. Damaged goods." "That's for Mr. Devlin to decide," the gunman said coldly. "But he's willing to be reasonable. Hand over the girl, and Hayes here can keep his ranch. Hell, he can even keep breathing." Samuel glanced back toward the cabin window where Emma waited, her face etched with a mixture of fear and grim determination. She was only 16 years old, and these men were casually talking about her like she was livestock, collateral, property, damaged goods. The very same dehumanizing words his own father had used to describe him. "And if I refuse?" Samuel asked, already knowing the answer. The lead gunman smiled, a chilling expression that held no warmth. "Well then, we take the girl anyway, and you become another tragic story about what happens to folks who interfere with Mr. Devlin's business." Samuel glanced down at the dead cattle they'd dragged to his fence line. The message was brutally clear. Devlin had seemingly endless resources, an army of loyal men, and a well-earned reputation that had effectively kept this entire territory in line for the last 5 years. But as Samuel looked at those 3 riders, he realized something critically important. They were standing here talking instead of just opening fire. That meant Devlin wanted to avoid trouble, at least for the moment. "I need time to think," Samuel called out, stalling for time. "You got 1 hour," the gunman replied. "Then we come calling, and we won't be asking politely." As the riders slowly pulled back to wait, Samuel felt Emma's hesitant presence right behind him. "There's something else," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something I didn't tell you about Devlin." Samuel turned, and the haunted look in her eyes told him everything was about to get exponentially worse. Samuel silently closed the cabin door behind them, his mind racing, trying to anticipate the coming storm. Whatever Emma was about to reveal to him, she definitely didn't want those men outside to overhear it. "Devlin isn't just collecting a debt," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my real father." The softly spoken words struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow, momentarily stealing his breath. He sank heavily into his chair, struggling to process what she'd just revealed. "The man outside," The one who tied you to the fence. My stepfather, Thomas Garrett. He married my mother when I was little. After..." Emma's voice broke with emotion. "Devlin threw us out." Samuel felt pieces clicking into place, forming a horrifying picture that he desperately didn't want to see. "Devlin abandoned you and your mother?" "Worse. When I turned 16 last month, he decided he wanted me back. Not as a daughter." Emma's hands clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white. "Thomas owed Devlin money from a poker game. Devlin offered to forgive the entire debt in exchange for me." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd known men just like Devlin during the war, powerful men who simply took whatever they wanted and then coldly called it business. "But Thomas got scared," Emma continued, her voice trembling. "Said if Devlin found out what kind of man he really was, what he'd been doing to me all these years, Devlin would kill him for damaging his property." The room went deathly quiet. Samuel understood now why Emma had that haunted look in her eyes, why she flinched at sudden movements, why she carried herself with such quiet resignation. Thomas Garrett wasn't just a coward who'd abandoned a helpless child. He was a complete monster who'd been systematically hurting her for years. So instead of facing Devlin's anger, he decided to let you die. Emma nodded almost imperceptibly. "Make it look like I ran away and got killed by wolves. Then he could tell Devlin I was already dead when the debt came due." Samuel stood up abruptly and walked back to the window, his gaze fixed on the three riders still patiently waiting in the distance. But now he saw the entire situation in a completely different light. This wasn't just about protecting Emma from her abusive stepfather. This was about keeping her away from a heartless man who'd already callously thrown her away once, and now desperately wanted to claim her for his own twisted, selfish purposes. "There's more," Emma said quietly, her voice laced with dread. "Devlin doesn't know Thomas has been hurting me. If he finds out, he'll kill Thomas, but then he'll still take me." Samuel turned back to her, his gaze unwavering. "And you'd rather die than go with either of them, wouldn't you?" The unspoken question hung heavily in the air between them. Samuel thought about his own brutal father, about the relentless beatings, the gnawing hunger, the constant suffocating fear. He'd finally run away at 17 and spent the last 20 years painstakingly building a life where no one, absolutely no one, could ever have power over him again. Now he was suddenly faced with a life-altering choice that would inevitably destroy that hard-won safety forever. "Emma," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "There's something you should know about me, about why I understand what you're going through." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and expectant, desperately searching for a glimmer of hope. She'd been instinctively looking for someone who truly understood her pain, and now, incredibly, she'd finally found him. "My father sold me to a man named Crawford when I was 15, Samuel continued, his voice low and steady. "Said I was payment for a gambling debt. I spent 2 long years as that man's slave before I finally found the courage to run." Emma's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. "The scars on my back," Samuel continued, his voice unwavering. "They're from Crawford's whip. The reason I've lived alone for 20 years is because I swore to myself that no one would ever, ever have power over me again." Outside, one of the riders shouted impatiently, "Time's almost up, Hayes!" Samuel looked back at Emma, seeing his own deeply troubled past so clearly reflected in her terrified eyes. He'd spent the last 2 decades running relentlessly from men like Devlin and Crawford and Thomas Garrett. But Emma couldn't run. She was only 16 years old, completely alone, and had absolutely nowhere else to go. "What are you thinking?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel picked up his trusty rifle and carefully checked the ammunition, his movements deliberate and precise. I'm thinking it's finally time I stopped running." Samuel stepped back boldly onto his porch, his rifle now ready. The hour was up, and the three riders were already moving closer, their horses' hooves drumming ominously against the hard-packed earth. "Time's up, Hayes!" Thomas Garrett called out, his voice strained. "Hand over the girl, and we'll ride out peaceful." "Can't do that," Samuel replied, his voice carrying clearly across the growing distance between them. The lead gunman, a lean, wiry man with cold, dead eyes, nudged his horse forward a single step. "Then you've chosen poorly." But before anyone could even draw their iron, the distinct sound of approaching horses echoed from the ridge directly behind Samuel's cabin. More riders were coming, at least 6 of them, moving fast and purposefully toward the inevitable confrontation. Thomas Garrett's face instantly went white with fear. He wasn't supposed to come himself. Samuel felt his blood suddenly chill as he recognized the imposing man leading the new group of riders. Marcus Devlin rode like a king surveying his domain, flanked by heavily armed men who'd all earned their brutal reputations with blood and violence. Devlin was noticeably older than Samuel had initially expected, maybe 50 years old, with silver hair and impeccably expensive clothes that looked strangely out of place in the rugged Wyoming wilderness. "Well, well," Devlin said, his voice smooth and menacing as his horse stepped delicately around the dead cattle lying on the ground. "What do we have here?" Thomas Garrett's voice cracked with fear. "Mr. Devlin, I can explain." "I'm sure you can, Thomas," Devlin replied, his tone dangerously soft. "But first, I'd like to hear from Mr. Hayes." Devlin's pale eyes fixed intently on Samuel. "I understand you have something that rightfully belongs to me." Samuel kept his rifle carefully aimed at the original 3 riders, but he was painfully aware of Devlin's men quietly spreading out behind him, effectively cutting off any chance of escape. 9 against 1 were clearly impossible odds. "Nothing here belongs to you," Samuel said, his voice ringing with defiance. Devlin smiled thinly, but there was absolutely no warmth in his expression. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Hayes. You see, Thomas here owes me a considerable sum of money, and the collateral for that debt is currently hiding in your cabin." "Emma's not collateral," Samuel shot back, his voice filled with righteous anger. "She's a human being." Devlin's voice sharpened, his tone hardening. "Is that what she's calling herself now?" The casual way he said it made Samuel's skin crawl. This man didn't simply want Emma back as payment for a debt. There was something deeply personal, something almost possessive in his tone. "I think it's time we sorted this out properly," Devlin continued, his gaze never wavering. "Thomas, you lying snake. Did you really think you could just let my daughter die and I wouldn't find out?" The shocking words hit everyone like a thunderclap. Devlin knew that Emma was his daughter. He'd always known. Thomas Garrett's horse danced nervously beneath him. "She ain't worth the trouble, Mr. Devlin," he stammered, his voice shaking with fear. "I was doing you a favor." Devlin's gun appeared suddenly in his hand, so fast that Samuel barely even saw him draw. The gunshot echoed sharply across the prairie, and Thomas Garrett instantly toppled from his saddle, clutching wildly at his bloody shoulder. "Nobody asked you to think, Thomas," Devlin said coldly, holstering his weapon. Samuel's mind raced, trying to anticipate the unfolding events. Devlin had just casually shot Emma's abusive stepfather for trying to kill her, but the cold calculation in the man's eyes made it chillingly clear that this wasn't an act of mercy, this was an act of ownership. "Now then," Devlin said smoothly, holstering his weapon, "let's discuss this like civilized men. I want my daughter back, Mr. Hayes, and I'm prepared to be generous." From deep inside the cabin, Samuel suddenly heard the sharp, unmistakable crack of breaking glass. Emma was running. The distinct sound of Emma crashing through the back window sent every man instinctively reaching for their guns. Samuel spun back sharply toward the cabin, torn between desperately protecting Emma's escape and confronting the 9 armed men now standing directly in front of him. "Find her!" Devlin roared, his face contorted with rage. 3 of his riders immediately spurred their horses sharply around the cabin. Samuel had to make a split-second decision. He dove headfirst off the porch as bullets instantly splintered the wood where he'd just been standing, rolling quickly behind the old water trough as deadly lead whistled menacingly overhead. His rifle cracked twice, dropping one of Devlin's men instantly and sending another one tumbling clumsily from his saddle. But the odds were still impossibly stacked against him. Enough. Devlin's voice cut sharply through the chaotic gunfire. "I want her alive, you idiots!" The shooting suddenly stopped, leaving only the agonizing sound of wounded men groaning in pain and horses stamping nervously on the dry ground. Samuel pressed himself tightly against the side of the water trough, quickly calculating his rapidly dwindling chances. 7 men left, counting Devlin. His rifle held only 3 more precious rounds. "Hayes," Devlin called out, his voice dangerously calm. "This is completely pointless. She can't outrun horses, and there's absolutely nowhere to hide on this vast prairie. Surrender now, and I'll let you live." Samuel risked a quick glance around the water trough. 2 of Devlin's men had already dismounted and were carefully flanking him from both sides, methodically setting up a deadly crossfire. In just a few minutes, they'd have him completely pinned down. "What do you want with her?" Samuel shouted back, desperate to buy her some time. "She's my blood, my responsibility." Devlin's voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd never, ever been denied anything he truly wanted. "I made a terrible mistake 16 years ago, letting her mother take her away. I won't make that mistake again." Samuel suddenly heard the thunderous sound of horses returning back toward the cabin. The riders chasing Emma were coming back, which could only mean either they'd already managed to catch her, or they'd completely lost her trail. "Boss!" one of them called out, his voice strained. "She's holed up in the rocks behind the ridge, but she's got a gun, and she knows how to use it." A wave of relief washed over Samuel. Emma had somehow managed to make it to the rocky outcropping where he'd painstakingly taught himself to shoot nearly 20 years ago. It was an ideal defensive position, providing excellent cover with clear sight lines in all directions. She could potentially hold out there for hours. "Stubborn girl," Devlin muttered under his breath. "Just like her mother." Samuel suddenly saw a small window of opportunity. While Devlin was momentarily distracted, he sprinted desperately from behind the water trough toward his cabin, a hail of bullets chasing him across the open ground. He somehow managed to make it to the corner and pressed his back hard against the rough logs, breathing heavily. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Hayes," Devlin called out. "I have 20 more men just an hour's ride from here. When they arrive, this ends badly for everyone." Samuel fully believed him. Devlin clearly had the extensive resources to turn this into a full-blown siege, and eventually, Emma would inevitably run out of both ammunition and water. But something in the man's tone suggested that he really didn't want to wait that long. "Why not just let her go?" Samuel shouted back, his voice filled with genuine anger. "You threw her away once. Why is she suddenly so important now?" The silence stretched out for so long that Samuel began to wonder if he'd pushed too far. When Devlin finally answered, his voice carried a deep weight that fully explained everything. "Because she's the only family I have left," Devlin admitted, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable, "and because 16 years ago, I callously let pride keep me from claiming what was rightfully mine." His tone turned darker, filled with regret. "I won't make that mistake twice." Samuel suddenly felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about a gambling debt or some kind of cold business transaction. This was about a deeply flawed man who'd spent the last 16 years bitterly regretting his impulsive choice to abandon his own daughter. And now, He desperately wanted to own her completely. From the rocks behind the ridge, Emma's rifle suddenly cracked once, the sharp sound echoing across the prairie. A man cursed loudly, and Samuel heard the distinct sound of someone heavily hitting the ground. 8 men left. But as Samuel peered cautiously around the cabin corner, he saw Devlin pulling something from his saddlebags that made his blood run absolutely cold. Dynamite. "Last chance, Hayes," Devlin called out, his voice hard and unwavering. "Convince her to come down, or I'll blast those rocks apart with her still in them." Samuel watched Devlin calmly prepare the deadly dynamite with steady hands, each movement precise and practiced. This wasn't just a bluff. The man would coldly blow Emma to pieces rather than risk losing her again. "You've got 1 minute to talk some sense into her, Hayes," Devlin called out, casually lighting the fuse. "Then I solved this problem permanently." Samuel made the hardest decision of his entire life. He stepped boldly out from behind the protective cover of the cabin, his hands raised high above his head, his rifle lying uselessly on the ground. "Emma!" he shouted loudly toward the rocks. "Come down!" From her well-defended position, Emma's voice rang out clear and defiant. "I'd rather die up here!" "No!" Samuel's voice cracked with raw desperation. "Listen to me, there's another way!" The fuse on Devlin's deadly dynamite burned steadily, relentlessly ticking away. Maybe 30 seconds left. Samuel's mind raced furiously through every single possibility, every angle, every slim chance of somehow saving the young girl who'd so unexpectedly reminded him what it truly meant to protect someone weaker than yourself. Then, he suddenly saw it. The one critical thing that Devlin hadn't even considered. "Devlin!" Samuel called out, his voice strained. "You throw that dynamite and you'll never know the truth about what Thomas did to her." The fuse continued to burn, but Devlin's eyes instantly sharpened, his gaze narrowing. "What truth? Why do you think Thomas was suddenly so eager to get rid of her? What do you think he's been doing to your daughter for the past 6 years?" Samuel saw understanding dawn slowly on Devlin's face, quickly followed by something that looked remarkably like genuine horror. The man's hand instinctively moved toward the dynamite, but it was already too late to stop the burning fuse. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Samuel sprinted desperately toward Devlin, diving recklessly at the man just as he frantically tried to throw the lit dynamite safely away from the rocks. They collided violently in a tangled mess of arms and legs, the lit stick flying wildly from Devlin's desperate grasp. The deafening explosion shook the very earth beneath them, but it detonated harmlessly out in the open prairie, sending dirt and debris raining down on everyone. When the dust finally settled, Samuel found himself staring directly down the cold barrel of Devlin's Colt revolver. But the man's gaze wasn't even focused on him anymore. It was fixed intently on Thomas Garrett, who was desperately crawling away through the dirt, clutching his bloodied shoulder. "Thomas," Devlin said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Come here." What followed was both swift and brutal. Thomas Garrett died knowing exactly why, and Devlin's remaining men silently watched their powerful boss execute a man in cold blood without even flinching. But when it was finally over, Devlin genuinely surprised everyone. He slowly looked up toward the rocks where Emma still waited, and called out in a voice that Samuel barely even recognized, "Emma, I'm sorry." The softly spoken words carried clearly across the prairie like a desperate prayer. "I'm not coming down," Emma shouted back, her voice filled with a mixture of defiance and grief. "I know," Devlin replied, his voice strangely resigned. "And I'm not asking you to." He mounted his horse and slowly gathered his reins, looking suddenly much older than he had just an hour ago. "Hayes," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "She's not safe as long as I'm alive. Men like me don't change." He paused, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "But men like you do." He reached carefully into his coat and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, tossing it gently to Samuel. "There's enough money there to take her far, far away from here. Start over somewhere I'll never find you." "Why?" Samuel asked, confused. Devlin looked up toward the rocks one last time, his gaze filled with an emotion that Samuel couldn't quite decipher. "Because 16 years ago, I failed to be her father," he said softly. "Today, you succeeded." He turned his horse and silently rode away with his remaining men, leaving Samuel alone with the heavy silence and the weight of an impossible gift. Emma finally came down from the rocks an hour later. They buried Thomas Garrett without any ceremony and quickly packed what few belongings they had. By sunset, they were silently riding slowly toward Colorado, toward a future that neither of them had even dared to imagine that morning. Behind them, the vast Wyoming prairie stretched out empty and silent, holding its long-held secrets in the gathering darkness.